At 2 p.m. on October 23, 1944, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato as Japan's last great surface fleet pushed into the Sibuyan Sea. Behind him sailed an armada of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers gathered for one desperate gamble: break through, reach Leyte Gulf, and smash the American invasion at anchor. The entire plan rested on a single belief: that U.S. carrier strength in the area was limited and manageable. That belief was wrong, catastrophically wrong. And within hours, Kurita would realize the balance of the war had shifted beyond repair. If you value deep cinematic history like this, subscribe to No Man's Land, because stories like this deserve to be told right. Kurita's mission was never about winning a fair fight. It was about exploiting a narrow window that Japanese planners believed still existed. The American landings at Leyte were massive, but vulnerable. Hundreds of transports sat crowded in the Gulf, protected mainly by aircraft. If Kurita's battleships could reach them, even briefly, the damage could be catastrophic. One afternoon of shell fire could undo months of American progress and force a pause in the entire Pacific campaign. But this plan balanced on a single assumption: American carrier strength in the Philippines was limited. Japanese intelligence estimated 4 or 5 fleet carriers operating nearby, perhaps split into 2 task groups. Dangerous? Yes, but survivable if the northern decoy succeeded. If American carriers chased the decoy force, logic came from experience. Japan knew how difficult carriers were to build, crew, and operate. They assumed the Americans faced the same constraints. Carriers required enormous shipyards, specialized labor, trained air groups, and years of preparation. No navy could casually mass large numbers of them in one place without stripping other theaters bare. The Americans had commitments everywhere. The Atlantic, fuel was burned. Steel was committed. Kurita sailed believing he was facing strong resistance, but resistance with limits. What no one told him was that those limits no longer existed. The enemy he was about to meet was not operating under the same rules Japan had built its war around. And once Kurita realized that truth, it would already be too late to turn back. Well before Kurita ever put to sea, small warning signs were already appearing inside Japan's naval intelligence system. They didn't arrive as dramatic revelations. They came as inconsistencies, reports that didn't quite line up, carrier movements that seemed too frequent, task group identifiers that didn't match previously known deployments. Individually, each detail could be explained away. Together, they suggested something was off. A handful of officers began quietly questioning the numbers. They weren't claiming the Americans had unlimited carriers, only that U.S. production and deployment seemed faster than expected. New carriers appeared in operations sooner than Japanese timelines said they should. Ships that were believed to still be fitting out were suddenly active in combat zones. Replacement carriers showed up not years later, but months later. The response from senior staff was cautious and conservative. Intelligence doctrine demanded confirmation, and overestimating the enemy was considered as dangerous as underestimating them. The prevailing belief was that American shipbuilding was efficient, not revolutionary. Yes, the United States could replace losses faster than Japan, but only within reasonable bounds. Anything beyond that felt exaggerated. Japanese planners also assumed American carriers would be divided across multiple theaters. Even if total numbers were increasing, they believed concentration would remain limited. No single battle, they reasoned, would ever face overwhelming carrier strength. The Americans had too many responsibilities and too many oceans to cover. So the reports were filed, not escalated. New sightings were treated as temporary concentrations or misidentifications. Radio intercepts were analyzed narrowly. Prisoner statements were discounted as confusion or exaggeration. The intelligence picture remained tidy, reassuring, and fatally incomplete. By the time Kurita sailed, the warnings had already been absorbed into the system and neutralized. The numbers he was given reflected what Japanese planners believed should be possible, not what was actually happening. The gap between assumption and reality was growing, quietly and relentlessly, and Kurita was about to sail straight into it. At the heart of Japan's miscalculation was a quiet, deadly habit: mirror imaging. Japanese planners didn't just estimate American capabilities, they projected Japanese limitations onto an enemy that did not share them. Everything Japan knew about carriers told them there had to be ceilings. Shipyards could only do so much. Crews could only be trained so fast. Air groups needed years to reach combat readiness. These weren't opinions to Japanese officers. They were facts of life. Japanese carrier doctrine reinforced this belief. Their fleet was built around careful balance and precision. Carriers operated in pairs, sometimes 3 together, but never in massive formations. Communications bandwidth, fighter direction, and strike coordination all imposed practical limits. Beyond a certain point, adding more carriers didn't increase effectiveness. It created confusion. From that perspective, the idea of operating 8, 10, or 12 carriers together seemed reckless and inefficient. So Japanese intelligence assumed the Americans would think the same way. Even if the United States built more carriers overall, they would still be constrained by coordination problems and logistical reality. Carriers would be spread out. The Atlantic would demand protection. Europe would demand support. The Pacific would be divided between multiple advances. No single Japanese force would ever face overwhelming carrier concentration. That assumption shaped everything. When American carrier numbers appeared higher than expected, planners didn't revise the total. They assumed temporary concentration. When carrier strikes came faster than anticipated, they assumed higher operational tempo, not higher force strength. Every contradiction was bent back into the existing framework instead of breaking it. What Japanese planners failed to understand was that the Americans weren't optimizing for elegance or balance. They were optimizing for mass. Radar-directed fighter control, standardized procedures, and decentralized command allowed U.S. carriers to operate in numbers Japan believed impossible. What Japan saw as chaos, the Americans had turned into a system. By the time Kurita sailed, Japanese planning was built on rules that no longer applied. The enemy was no longer bound by the same limits. And when those limits vanished, so did Japan's chance of controlling the fight. By late 1943, the gap between Japanese estimates and American behavior was no longer subtle. U.S. carrier operations struck hard, withdrew in good order, then reappeared elsewhere with the same strength. There was no sign of exhaustion, no long recovery periods, no thinning of forces. Japanese reconnaissance noted these concentrations with unease. In several operations, American carriers appeared in numbers that should have left other theaters dangerously exposed. Yet no weakness appeared. Atlantic operations continued. Central Pacific advances accelerated. Instead of robbing one front to supply another, the Americans seemed able to reinforce everywhere at once. Each time this happened, intelligence officers reached for familiar explanations. Perhaps carriers were rotating rapidly. That American carrier strength was fundamentally higher than Japan believed possible. Then came the strikes that were impossible to ignore. American carriers demonstrated the ability to mass air power without losing coordination. Fighter cover remained dense. Strike timing remained precise. Air operations continued day after day without degradation. Japanese planners had believed that such concentration would collapse under its own complexity. Instead, it functioned smoothly. This should have forced a complete reassessment. Instead, it triggered rationalization. The Japanese intelligence system treated each encounter as an exception rather than evidence of a new normal. Reports were analyzed individually. The United States was no longer fighting with limited forces carefully allocated across the globe. It was fighting with abundance. And abundance changes the rules of war. What Japanese planners never truly grasped was that American carrier production wasn't improving slowly. It was accelerating. Japan understood shipbuilding as a craft. Each carrier was a complex, almost bespoke project that demanded years of labor, highly trained workers, and careful sequencing. From that perspective, faster construction meant shaving months, not years. America approached the problem differently. It treated carriers as an industrial product. American shipyards broke carrier construction into standardized sections built simultaneously instead of sequentially. Hull segments, internal compartments, propulsion systems, and flight deck components were fabricated in parallel, then assembled rapidly. Welding replaced much of the slower riveting process. Labor was divided into specialized tasks that could be learned quickly, allowing massive workforce expansion without long apprenticeships. The result was not just faster ships, but a system that improved with every hull laid down. Japanese intelligence assumed carrier production followed a straight line. One ship finished, then the next. American production followed a curve. Each new carrier took less time than the last. Shipyards learned. Supply chains stabilized. Mistakes disappeared. What looked like efficient replacement was actually exponential growth. Worse still, the Americans didn't rely on a single yard. Multiple shipyards were building fleet carriers at the same time. Others converted civilian hulls into light carriers. Escort carriers poured out of adapted commercial yards at astonishing speed. The distinction between naval and civilian industry simply didn't exist the way it did in Japan. Japanese intelligence received fragments of this reality. New hull numbers, unfamiliar ship names, reports of carriers commissioning at shocking speed. But the implications were never fully accepted. The idea that carriers could be built in little more than a year felt physically impossible based on Japan's experience. So the evidence was questioned instead of the assumptions. By the time Kurita sailed, American shipyards were no longer catching up. They were overwhelming the equation entirely. And the fleet Kurita was about to face wasn't the product of clever tactics or daring strategy. It was the output of an industrial system running at full throttle. The first American aircraft appeared late in the morning on October 24th, and immediately something felt wrong. Not tactically wrong, mathematically wrong. The formations were too clean, too numerous, arriving with a rhythm that didn't fit the briefing Kurita had been given. These weren't isolated strikes probing for weakness. They were organized waves, arriving on schedule, cycling in and out as if the attackers had depth to spare. Musashi drew the focus. Dive bombers came first, then torpedo planes from multiple directions, forcing impossible choices. Evade one spread and accept another. Armor held at first, but hits accumulated faster than damage control could absorb. What stunned Kurita wasn't just the accuracy, it was the persistence. As one wave departed, another appeared. There was no lull, no breathing room, no sign the attackers were running low on aircraft or pilots. Kurita began counting. A single carrier could generate a powerful strike, but only at intervals. Aircraft had to land, refuel, rearm, and launch again. 4 carriers might sustain pressure for a time. 5, perhaps, if pushed hard. But this tempo didn't slow. If anything, it intensified. The Americans were launching new attacks before earlier aircraft could reasonably have returned to their decks. By early afternoon, Musashi was crippled, slowing, listing, systems failing. Still the attacks came. Bombs, torpedoes, again and again. When the order was finally given to abandon ship, Musashi had absorbed punishment no battleship could survive. She capsized, taking over 1,000 men with her. Kurita watched her sink and understood something fundamental had changed. This wasn't bad luck or superior tactics. This was volume. The kind of volume only possible if American carrier strength in the area was far greater than reported. The intelligence estimate no longer mattered. The sky itself had corrected it, and the correction was brutal. As darkness fell on October 24th, Kurita was no longer guessing. Reports from reconnaissance aircraft operating out of Luzon began arriving, and for the first time, they weren't ambiguous. The photographs showed multiple American carrier groups operating east of the Philippines. Not a single task force, not a temporary concentration. Several distinct formations moving and striking in coordination. The initial count was staggering. 13 large fleet carriers were visible, with additional smaller carriers nearby that could not be clearly identified in the fading light. 13. The number alone invalidated every briefing Kurita had received before sailing. Japanese intelligence had estimated 4 to 5 carriers in the entire operational area. The reality was nearly 3 times that, and these were only the carriers within camera range. Kurita requested clarification immediately. Were all of these carriers committed to the Philippines, or were some passing through? The reply removed any remaining doubt. All identified carriers were active in Philippine operations, organized into multiple task groups conducting coordinated strikes. This was not a rotation. It was concentration. The implications were devastating. 13 fleet carriers meant hundreds of aircraft available at any moment. It meant sustained operations without pause. It meant Kurita's battleships were operating under an air umbrella they could never escape. Even if the northern decoy succeeded perfectly and drew off half the carriers, the remaining force would still outmatch anything Japan could counter. For the first time, Kurita grasped the full scale of the miscalculation. This wasn't a narrow intelligence error. It was systemic. American carrier strength in one battle exceeded Japan's total carrier strength at its wartime peak. And if 13 carriers were operating here, total American carrier strength across the Pacific had to be far higher. Numbers that made Japan's entire naval strategy obsolete. Kurita sent a request to Combined Fleet Headquarters asking for permission to withdraw. The mission, given actual enemy strength, was no longer achievable. Continuing meant sacrificing Japan's remaining heavy surface fleet for no strategic gain. The response came back clear and final. The operation must continue. Other forces were committed. The plan could not be undone. Kurita turned west in the darkness, fully aware now that he was sailing into odds that no amount of courage or discipline could overcome. At first light on October 25th, Kurita's force emerged from San Bernardino Strait and spotted what looked like salvation. Ahead lay a group of small American escort carriers with thin screens of destroyers and destroyer escorts. These were not fleet carriers. They were slow, lightly armored, and never meant to face battleships. For a brief moment, it seemed the war had slipped backward into familiar rules. Big guns versus small decks. Steel against plywood. Kurita ordered a general attack. Battleships opened fire at extreme range, their massive shells walking toward fleeing targets. Cruisers closed in. The American escort carriers scattered eastward, launching every aircraft they could get airborne. The planes that came at Kurita were not designed for anti-ship combat. Many carried ground attack weapons, rockets, depth charges, anything available. But they attacked anyway, diving through flak, making repeated runs, refusing to break contact. The escort carriers weren't trying to win. They were buying time. Smoke appeared and vanished in smoke. Fire control solutions were lost. Precious minutes slipped away. Then the reports came in that changed everything. Aircraft were approaching from the north. Large formations, fast, well-organized. These were not the desperate sorties from the escort carriers. These were fleet carrier aircraft, arriving in strength. The northern decoy had failed to pull American power away. Instead, the Americans had split their forces, keeping heavy carrier groups ready while still engaging elsewhere. Kurita now understood the trap. The escort carriers had held him in place long enough for the real strike to arrive. His battleships were exposed, executed by a navy with depth to spare, and the hammer was already falling. By mid-morning on October 25th, the illusion was gone. Wave after wave of American aircraft tore into Kurita's force with a scale that could no longer be rationalized. This was not 13 carriers worth of pressure. It felt like more. Attacks overlapped. Strike intervals shortened instead of lengthening. Fresh aircraft arrived while others were still returning. The Americans were not reaching the limits of endurance. They were operating comfortably inside them. Heavy cruisers began falling out of formation, damaged and burning. Destroyers were crippled. Even Yamato. There was no longer any doubt about American industrial power. The truth was undeniable. The United States could lose ships and replace them faster than Japan could damage them. Inside Japan's leadership, that truth was quietly acknowledged and quietly buried. Admitting it openly meant admitting the war was unwinnable. So operations continued. Men were sent into battles against forces leadership privately knew could not be defeated. Leyte Gulf wasn't just the end of Japan's surface fleet. It was the moment the numbers finally broke through denial. The war would continue for months, but its outcome was already decided. Not by courage or tactics, but by industrial reality that arrived over Kurita's fleet in endless waves of aircraft.